Is Spain to blame for the maiming of the Maine? From the information we have today, it's sort of an unanswered question, as the exact cause of her sinking is still somewhat blurry. The USS Maine was an armored cruiser of the United States Navy initially constructed in response to the rapidly advancing navies of the industrial world. Basically, the US didn't want to get one-upped by Brazil. The Maine, however, ended up an unstable mess of machinery and weirdly placed guns. And after her keel was laid down in August of 1888, she took 7.5 years to be completed, making her obsolete upon commissioning. She had a ram bow, 2 main 10-inch gun batteries, 2 thumbs, and a boatload of determination. With the US government continually making an effort to pack a little more power in its naval arsenal, the Maine was old news by the time it was finally in service. Her lack of symmetry on each side is enough to trigger ADHD in anyone enlisting on the high seas. One of the most vital facts throughout naval history, however, is that the most famous ships are those that sank. How did the Maine gain its footnote in history? Throughout the late 1800s, centuries of colonial oppression led Cuban revolutionaries to advocate for independence from Spain. As America was going through a patriotic spike in the 1890s, and the American press was reporting on atrocities occurring in the colony of Cuba, the United States backed the Cuban revolutionaries, and backed not backing the Spanish. This was a virtually actionless backing by the US, but it led to some tense glares from Spain across the pond. Although the US was neutral throughout the numerous revolutionary wars of Cuba, when violent protests broke out in Havana in early 1898, the American military sent the USS Maine to the port city, mostly to defend American interests. And by defend American interests, I mean show the Spaniards the American gun show. The Spanish government was probably a little intimidated by the action, but it wouldn't cause them to do anything about it, right? Correct, actually. The Spanish government had little to gain from sinking an outdated armored cruiser sent by a nation that could absolutely pummel them into the ground if they wanted to. Despite this obvious little fact, at 9:40 p.m. on February 15th, an enormous explosion came from the Maine's magazine, resulting in the front of the ship nearly blasting away from the rest of it. She sank, obviously, with 268 fatalities, 2 of whom being officers, the rest being sailors. Now, there are a lot of theories about the source of the fatal blast, ranging from a coal fire to an American journalist intentionally bombing it. On March 28th of 1898, the United States Naval Court of Inquiry declared that an external explosion, probably a sea mine, detonated the ship's magazine. The court, however, didn't specify exactly who planted whatever it was. Now, Spain didn't really have much of a motive to sink the USS Maine, but they did have a responsibility, and that responsibility was to protect foreign ships in their harbors. Even if Spain didn't sink the Maine, under international law, the Spanish were supposed to keep friendly ships safe when in their ports, so it was sort of their problem whether they sank the ship or not. There's a little leeway here and there, however, as the Spanish were amidst a large-scale civil rebellion at the time. America, specifically the American press, didn't see it that way. The press sort of aggravated the incident by playing it up with a few exaggerations here and there. But it's not like they'd do that today, right? The United States wanted foreign powers out of its backyard, and the sinking of the Maine ended up becoming a rally cry for the Americans. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. It was a rhyme made in heaven. Or hell. The American press, and therefore the American people, seemed to predominantly believe that Spain had sunk the ship. Another American inquiry in 1911 had the same results. They too believed an external explosion or explosive device sank the vessel. It wasn't until 1976 that they concluded the outbreak of a fire in the magazine probably caused the explosion. Now, although it seems a little ridiculous, let's assume for a moment the Spanish were in fact responsible for the sinking. What exactly would their motive be? Well, some sources indicate that the Maine's main battery was pointed directly at Morro Castle, or some other fortification, threatening Spanish control of the city. This probably wasn't intentionally done if true, but the Spaniards were already feeling a bit tense with a foreign warship, technically a battleship, stationed in such a significant colonial port. Not only that, the warship was of a nation that supported a rebellion against the owners of said colonial port. The Spanish could have sunk the vessel in revenge against the US for backing the Cuban revolutionaries. They could have sunk the vessel thinking it was there to put pressure on their colonial policies. Despite all of these arguments against Spain, there's just too much evidence working against the Americans' conclusion. For starters, the Spanish did in fact use mines to defend their ports, but they used them primarily in channels, not anchorages. The mines they used had huge violent explosions, while the sea mine explosion that potentially sank the Maine had no such characteristics. There were right-wing Spanish nationalists in Cuba who could have sunk the ship with a planted explosive, but the majority of them were enlisted and knew the consequences of such an action, as did their leaders, whether in the military or not. Could America have staged the sinking? Well, if they did, they probably shouldn't have sunk one of America's 6 most powerful warships, especially in a time when they're trying to look beefy to the European powers. They won't have to worry about that for too long, though. So, in the end, the most likely cause of the sinking was a fire that got out of hand and ignited the battery. Less climactic, but in the end, real life always is. So what did we learn? Take what the press says with a grain of salt. Be careful with ships sailing to Havana, and Spain is probably not to blame for the maiming of the Maine.